Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 7 in Communication in the Real World on Culture and Communication. This is the version of the textbook hosted by James Madison University. Now, there's a lot I could say about culture and communication. Intercultural communication is one of my favorite classes to teach, but certainly this chapter is just one chapter on it, so it's a lot more condensed. So the first thing that I like to say is how I define culture. And when I'm looking at culture, there are so many things that could be related to culture. So general things that this textbook will talk about is culture. Culture can be part of our, the culture of European American heritage. It can be, gender can be part of culture, sexual orientation, disability, a religion can be a part of culture. But there also can be a workplace culture, right? There can be culture, a gaming culture, certainly culture related to our hobbies, our interests, whatever it may be. So the textbook, so that's how I define it. I define it very broadly. When I ask my students to talk about culture, all different aspects of your identity, anything you identify as in a group someone may identify with, it could be a rural culture. All right, I live in rural Minnesota, so there's rural culture. But again, it's there's a lot of different ways, aspects, and parts of our identity that are related to culture. The textbook says culture is a complicated word to define, as there are a lot of ways to look at culture. There's not just one regular definition. But here it defines culture as the ongoing negotiation of learned patterned beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors. So with this definition, it's in some ways culture is stable and not changing because it's held over time. Sometimes those values last, but it's also negotiated. It can be dynamic. It can be changed. So you can trace those changes in culture to analyze them and better understand why society is the way it is. There's a broader culture, and then there's also subcultures. And there's it talks about culture is learned, and it can be learned through institutions like family, through school, through peers, through the media, and there's similar patterns across cultural groups. So it can be the United States culture. There's patterns that we can look at there. United States versus China versus Russia versus Saudi Arabia versus Kenya. Those cultures are going to be different if we look very broadly. But there's also subgroups within any culture, any like country's culture that's super broad. There's certainly diversity within those groups. To look at some of those smaller groups to see how people operate and whether people kind of go with the norms, or do they push back against them, or do they just operate differently? So it talks about how there's personal, social, and cultural identities. That's how the textbooks kind of breaking down different parts of our identity. So, who am I? I always get students to think about, reflect in the first person about who they are and how the communication impacts, their relationships themselves. And when we're looking at culture, how does it impact your identity? So personal identities include components of self that are primarily intrapersonal, so within ourselves, and connected to life experiences. Our social identities that are components of self that are derived from involvement in social groups, which we are interpersonally connected, so within other people. So we may be fans of a sports team. We may, be voluntary in a group, like joined I've been part of, oh goodness, I just blanked in the Optimist Club. I was president of an Optimist Club once. So there's Lions Clubs. There's other of those community groups they can be a part of. You can be a part of a group on campus. I help advise the PTK Honor Society. There's Greek Life. There's family institutions that you may not choose to be part of a family, or you may have your chosen family, people that you say are family and close to. You can explicitly be part of a group by joining with membership, like PTK Honor Society. You join as a member for, you get invited based on your grades, but you choose to join, or maybe implicit to be part of a community, saying, "Hey, I'm a community of hip hop music listeners. I really like hip hop music." So whatever it may be, parts of these may impact both our personal and social identities. So our personal identity choices express who we are, and our social identity aligns us within a specific group or multiple groups. So these identities may change over time as you develop new experiences, new interests. You may find new friends or additional friends to get along with, and it may change your identity, how you perceive yourself, and how others perceive you. And that's the interesting thing about identity. What is the truth of who we are? Do we know ourselves best? We have our own biases. Our own biases on how we perceive ourselves, and maybe we always want to perceive ourselves in a positive light. Or does our best friend know ourselves better than we know ourselves? And sometimes I think that each person in our life knows a different version of herself. So my best friend knows me differently than my mom does, knows me differently than my boss does, right? They know different parts of me and know me through different frameworks and experiences and context. So they're going to know me differently and view me. There's certainly going to be similarities. I certainly have parts of my identity that are similar across those contexts, but there's also differences. And people may view me differently based on, the context in which they know me and the experiences they have with me. I always find it interesting looking at watching like Hot Bench, where the people are, oh, we've been friends for 20 years, and then we had this one fight, and now we're suing each other and don't want to talk anymore. It's like 20 years you're going to throw away, over that. Like, it's interesting to me what kind of friendship and how that identity changes from someone being your best friend to someone being an enemy of yours that you're, suing in court and never want to talk to again. Right? That perception changes of how you view each other in a very small amount of time. Sometimes those relationships can break down, which is very unfortunate. And sometimes on Hot Bench they get back together and okay, the friendship's more important now that we've resolved this conflict. And other times they stay apart. So again, just interesting how we change over time. Sometimes when we look at marriage and divorce in the United States too, sometimes people get divorced just because they change over time. People change. Sometimes couples change together and they stay very compatible. Other times they change and kind of go in separate directions. So kind of it's interesting how those things work. The textbook also talks about cultural identities. So they're based on socially constructed categories that teach us the way of being and include expectations of social behavior, of ways of acting. So since we are a part of them, often you're since birth, it's the least changeable. Oftentimes you're put into a group, again, they're socially constructed. Those social constructs can change. I know when I was a kid, we looked at gender in terms of, men and women. Some people still view gender as men and women, but others have in the United States have added, non-binary as a gender, or made it more common for people to identify transgender outside those gender norms. So again, trying to change that social construct to view the framework differently. And we see in cultures all around the world, it's very in some of them it's very common to have a third gender. That's just normal to them. Have it non-binary, or instead of having a strict binary, you may have maleness and femaleness instead of man and woman, and everybody has some femaleness and some maleness in them. So again, look at it as a spectrum instead of a binary. And so certainly there's other ways to socially construct the same category. We may say, hey, this is the way I know it, so this is true. But then you go to like a Polynesian culture and say, oh, you view it differently, right? I didn't even know that was, it could be seen differently. I just oftentimes we assume our way of knowing things and way of being is just the truth, right? It's what we were raised with. These are the categories that we've always known. But sometimes things change. Another example of the social construction categories, I've known some people who've come from Cuba to the United States, and in Cuba, they were white, right? They're saying, no, I was identified as white when I was Cuban. I come to the United States, now I'm a Latina, right? I used to be white, now I'm Latina. My race ethnicity changed based on moving because people categorize it differently. We look at other, like China. China has a lot of ethnic groups within China. In the United States, we'd say, oh, that group is Chinese. But within China, well, everyone's Chinese in China. So they'd be more specific about their ethnic groups. Or you look in, I think I've heard about this in several East African nations. Again, and East Africa was divided up by the Europeans, and it's weird the way the countries are not necessarily naturally sliced up based on the associations, but there's a lot. Okay, well, your tribe is very important in many of those communities. It's a tribal background, more that ethnic background than the national identity. And sometimes those ethnic backgrounds will be split over multiple countries, uh, but we associate more with the tribe than we do with a broader country, just kind of because of those weird divisions from the European colonization. So again, a lot of good talk. This is very interesting topic for me. I love talking about this, but I'm going to try and be brief here. I'm going to keep moving. So differences matter. Sometimes we notice that we have similarities or differences with people. We may look at others and place them as in groups or out groups, or saying, hey, we belong together because we have this similarity, or hey, we don't belong together based on this difference. But sometimes we're just judging people based on one thing we know about them. We maybe place someone within our in group just because, hey, we have the same interests. My daughter, she really likes rocks. I'm probably going to say this wrong, but she likes rocks because they have different powers or whatever, different meaning. Or again, I don't know rocks, but that's very important to her. So if she knows someone else who also enjoys knowing about these different stones and energy they have, or whatever, she's like, oh, you're an in group. I trust you. So she sees us in group because they share a common interest. I may see someone, they may like those rocks and the stones and different things, but I may view them as in group or out group based on something else, right? I'm not in part of that community. So I don't necessarily understand their fit within that in group, but again, we may relate to people in a different way. So sometimes we may, again, how we define in groups or out groups can be different. It can be based on just the one thing, having something in common. So sometimes I like playing video games. So I'll say, oh, we're gamers, so we're in this group together. We may have out groups of non-gamers, but the non-gamers may relate in different ways. And how you define the gaming community could also be different too. Some people, I kind of view it pretty broadly, like, okay, we may play, one or two games together, or the person may only play one or two games, but they still can be considered a gamer. They play games on their phone regularly. But other people say, oh no, you have to super invest in this community. You need to play like 20 hours a week or whatever. Make it a full-time job of playing video games. Right? I wish I could. Some days I wish I could, but I don't have time for that. I like video games, but I have work to do too. And I like my work, right? I like my job. So I spend a lot of time doing it. I like learning. I like being a teacher. So continuing moving forward, culture and identity are very complex. There's this thing called the ideology of domination that makes it seem natural and normal that some groups will have power over others. But in fact, there's hierarchy and domination that's been prevalent throughout modern human history. It's not likely the norm among early humans. So sometimes ideology of domination. So we have a hierarchy and a job. We have hierarchy, people at the top, people at the bottom. In the United States, with our government structure, we have president, we have governors. So we have people in different positions of power, and certainly, especially from that European heritage where that came from, that having people in those positions of powers may seem normal, but certainly there's other ways of existing. They talk about some early European contact with Native American groups. So there are some Native American groups that had a little bit more equality. Certainly, they may have had councils or representation, which the United States was actually based on and influenced by specific tribes within the eastern part of the United States. But again, it was viewed differently. I've also seen some collectives, especially in more developing countries. If we look into fair trade, they may have like a rotating leader, or where everyone has to take their turn being the leader. So it's not necessarily that they're the dominant one. It's just, oh, it's my turn to deal with this bureaucracy. So it may just be kind of a rotating position that everyone takes a turn at. So difference also matters because of the demographic patterns are changing. So I give a lot of speeches in rural Minnesota about the changing demographics and how we need to be kind of fluent in intercultural communication, just because the reality is the biggest population and growth, especially in rural communities in Minnesota, is communities of color, often influenced by immigrants and refugees who are choosing to live in rural communities. Right, rural places are great places to live, and so a lot of people choose to live in those rural communities. But it's changing the demographic makeup. There's also a lot of jobs within agriculture that attract certain groups to those rural communities. That's part of it as well. So it's about jobs, but it's also about the lifestyle. Sometimes people have immigrated from a rural community, so they want to live in a rural community. So again, that can just be part of those interactions as well. So again, people of color is definitely diversified. The biggest group that's growing in terms of race and ethnicity is multiracial people, because interracial relationships is fairly new within the United States of being legal, and more common. So it's actually fairly common, and it's a growing group of people. The fastest growing racial group is those people who would identify as multiracial. There's also been a lot more visibility for people who are gay and lesbian, LGBT, people with disabilities is also increasing. Again, just being out and open about, the issues that someone may have. There's growing Hispanic and Latino population is the second largest group. We see that a lot. Again, Minnesota, I live in rural Minnesota, so I see that a lot as a growing population. I live in Glencoe, and certainly we have a large migrant population who come up during the seasons to live in Texas during the winter, and then in the summer they come to Glencoe to work at some of the food processing facilities. So some legal and social changes has created a more open environment for sexual minorities and people with disabilities. Uh, and that affects our relationships, whether people can be open about who they are and in what context they may be open. Um, so again, in the workplace, can people be more open in the workplace about, having, mental health issues? Certainly that's true. They can be more open about having mental health issues than they could 10, 20 years ago. I worked for the state of Minnesota, and you know, my the union I belong to and the other unions in the state that work in higher education, they made it part of our policy that our healthcare contract covers 100% of mental health care without even a copay, because they see that it's growing for people to be open about their mental health issues and see that's a need that needs to be addressed. So again, a lot of structural changes, environmental changes, social changes that have allowed people to kind of conform with these identities and be open about it in new places that they may not have been able to before. There's also a lot of inequalities that exist among cultural groups that may affect our personal and social relationships. So it may impede our, you know, the conversations we have, especially if people are using stereotyped language. For example, I heard, I grew up and learned the word gyp, like if you rip someone off, or we don't want to gyp these people off. I used that in a meeting once, and that's just a word I used. And someone pulled me aside after the meeting and said, "Hey, Bradley, gyp comes from the word gypsy, which is, ethnic group, the Roma people in Europe." And I'm like, I didn't even know. I make sense now that I hear it, gypsy, right? Very, very closely related words. I'm like, I hear it now, but I didn't even know. Like, I didn't know I was using a racial slur to describe us wanting, saying I want to avoid doing something bad to other people. And so sometimes in our language, we have this biased language, which we don't even know. It may just be a word, and we may not know the root of that word and how to describe it. Another example, I come from a working class background. So one of the words that I kind of grew up with, if people are being elitist, is uppity. Oh, that's a very uppity person because they're all elitists. Bougie is a word that I use more now. It's more common to be heard. But again, uppity, if you look back, it used to refer specifically to like uppity Negroes, people who were formerly slaves and now saying, "Oh, I'm not slave anymore." And it was used in the South to say, "Oh, they think they're equal to us," and so it has a very negative racial connotation to it. I didn't even know, and it's like I didn't know the history of that word or that term. It's just a term that I kind of grew up with, and so now I see things differently. It's like, oh, maybe I should not use that word because of the racial connotation of it. So we may view things differently, once we start to understand the language. And certainly, someone from that minority group, if someone's a gypsy and hears me say the word gyp, they're going to know what it means, right? If a black person may be more likely to know the roots of the word uppity than I was, and so other people may know what I mean or may know the meaning of what I say and interpret it differently. So we look from chapter one. I'm encoding in a way which makes sense to me. Someone may decode what I'm saying in a very different way based on their experience, based on their knowledge, and may get offended. And right in terms of intercultural communication, certainly we have to be willing to accept that we may unintentionally offend somebody else. And it's not about our intention, it's about the impact we're having on someone else. So it's like, oh, I am so sorry. I didn't even know that. Thank you for letting me know to do things differently in the future. I appreciate that. I appreciate you being honest with me and correcting me in that instance instead of getting defensive and saying, "Oh no, I didn't mean to offend you. Why are you so hurt?" Right? It's a very different approach. And so I always, lean in and say, accept that I'm not perfect, accept that I say things wrong, that I've said things wrong in the past. I'm a communication teacher. I will continue to say things wrong, but I'll learn, right? I learn from those experiences. I learn to do better instead of getting defensive, instead of saying, "Oh, I didn't mean that. You shouldn't be so sensitive." I learned to do better. Right? And so I appreciate people calling me out. So it talks about people being complainers or whiners if you know if people are complaining about maybe the language we're using or actions we're taking or some of the structures in our society. And so people in non-dominant groups often have to advocate for changes and may have a lot of negative experiences with whatever the dominant group may be in that situation. And certainly, I believe that we all have identities that are more dominant and ones that are more subordinate. We don't always think about our dominant identities as much because they're just like normal to us. They're normal to the broader culture, so we don't think about. I don't think about myself as a white person very often in that context. But I know, based on my understanding of culture and communication, that people of color, hearing their stories, listening to those perspectives, have different experiences than I do based on my race. And I know some of my cultural norms that come from European American culture now, based on studying intercultural communication. When to me, it was just normal. To them, it may be a cultural difference. And so, an example of that, I visited the Northern Cheyenne Nation Native American community in Montana once when I was in college, and I studied intercultural communication. I took a class. I'm like, okay, I feel comfortable. I learned all this. And then we get there the first one of the first days to help move a Boys and Girls Club from one location to another. And so I was all excited to help. I want to help this community. I want to do something. It was a spring break service trip. I'm like excited about this. So we get to the Boys and Girls Club, and we sit there outside the club. It's closed, and we wait and we wait. It's like a couple of hours, and I was getting frustrated. Like I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm here for 1 week to help you out, and you're disrespecting my time. Right? That's how I felt. My time's being disrespected. They don't value or appreciate me. I was getting very frustrated. Now the guy who was coordinating our group, came with us. He just said, this is rest time, right? And rest time, and it's monochronic versus polychronic. That's a textbook academic way of saying it. So European Americans use a monochronic time, where we look at time as sequential. We say, hey, I'm going to get, it's at 7 p.m., so it's going to be at 7 p.m. It's going to last for 1 hour, so it's only going to last for 1 hour, right? Monochronic time is you have the schedule, and sometimes that's very stressful to have that monochronic time to try and stick to the schedule. It can be very, kind of stress you out. Whereas polychronic time, you're in the moment with what you're doing. I'm doing what I'm doing right now. So at that time, the Native Americans who we were working with, the people of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, they were doing something else, right? And that's had their full focus and attention. And they knew the Boys and Girls Club would get moved from one location to another. If it got moved today, if it got moved tomorrow, it's going to get moved, right? So to them, it didn't matter if we moved it right at that time or not. But certainly there was some miscommunication. And so we came back the next day, we moved everything, and it went fine, right? We got everything done. We got the project done that we came there to do. We were able to be very helpful, and and they were very happy with the help. And they had, they invited us for a meal. They invited us to a sweat lodge, kind of a more cultural tradition ceremony. And so they were very hospitable and welcoming. But it was just a matter of time. How I viewed time, I thought that was normal. We agreed we were going to start at 8 a.m. I was here at 8 a.m. Where are you? Right, you're being disrespectful to me. That was my cultural norm. Whereas, with the polychronic time, oh, we're going to get it done. It's going to get done. So I'm going to focus on what I'm doing right now and give it my full attention. Whereas me, monochronic time, I may be thinking about what I have to do next. I have to think about, when this gets done. It's a different cultural perspective. It's just a different way of viewing the same situation. And so if, and I, you know, European Americans, a dominant culture. So we look at a lot of our schools. We have a school schedule. So not only is it, that monochronic time is valued broadly in the culture, but it's also put into our schools where you have a very set schedule throughout the day through K through 12 education. So it's socialized. And a lot of our institutions promote this way of being, which it doesn't need to be that way, right? That's not the only way of doing things. Certainly, there are other ways which have value that we could look at. So again, I love talking about this topic. I can certainly talk a lot more. So this next section is talking about exploring specific cultural identities. So it defines social constructionism is a view that argues that self is formed through interactions with others, and in relationships to social, cultural, and political context. So identity is constructed. So we look at race as constructed because, again, I talked about how race is viewed differently in the United States versus in East Africa versus in China versus in Cuba, right? Race is going to be put differently. We're going to be in different groups based on where we're coming from. So race is a socially constructed category based on differences in appearance that have been used to create hierarchies that privilege some and disadvantage others. So race did not become a socially and culturally recognized marker until European colonial expansion in the 1500s. Certainly it changed over time. There were some scientists who were saying, "Oh, look, we have proof that white people are superior to other groups." Again, it was bunk science. It wasn't true, but certainly definitely flawed, biased, and some racist intentions. It was 100% intended to be racist in terms of calling people savages, Native American population savages. It was just racism. It wasn't There wasn't any, distinction that, from one group being superior towards the other. It was just racism. So there's that history of racism within the United States, within the world, especially when it comes to European colonization. So discussing race within that context of the United States, in a place that was originally held by Native American, many Native American tribes, now with a more European American domination, it's certainly kind of different. Certainly, there's a lot of heritage. We also look at, African Americans often being brought to the United States as slaves. There's newer immigrant and refugee groups from Africa, from Asia, from all over the world, which are also coming into the United States. And so race based on those backgrounds and that history has some impact on us, right? It has some impact on people. We see post 9/11, before 9/11, uh, Arab Americans, kind of the Middle East, they're grouped in with white. They're still in the census grouped in with as white. Kind of being Middle Eastern is within the white category. But now it's like, oh, well, you're brownish, right? So again, is that? And some people from even Eastern Europe say, I'm white. I'm technically white, but people say, oh, you have this ethnic curly hair. You have olive skin tone, kind of the Mediterranean skin tone. You're kind of brownish, and so that some people identify as brownish, even though they're technically categorized as white. Because again, it's socially constructed, right? There's not technically white. It's socially constructed categories. So there are 5 primary racial groups to be broken down, but certainly there's subgroups within each of those groups, and people often have specific preferences in being called the more specific terms. They'll just be called Asian American, saying, "Oh no, I'm Chinese or Korean or whatever it may be." So I may want more specific. It talks here also about the preferences within the African American community, the Black community, how that's changed over time. Right, Black and African American are pretty acceptable, but sometimes people prefer Black or prefer African American. I see here this textbook doesn't capitalize Black, so some people have been saying they want Black capitalized because it talks about a group of people. So, this woman talks. Brenda Allen noted when she was born in 1950, she had an N on her certificate for Negro. So some people, even in the 90s and 2000s, especially in the South, older Black people may have referred to themselves as Negro. That was the term that they preferred. But it says here in the textbook, colored or Negro are no longer considered appropriate. But some older people, that's the term they use, right? Older people from that community. So again, the preferences are sometimes on a community scale. Community scale, we look at intercultural communication. There's broad norms within a community, but then there's also specific preferences. There's diversity within any community. There's also Latin America, another group of people, often broadly said of where Spain has colonized in South Central America, parts of the Caribbean. I've heard some people, Latino, Latina, Latine with the E at the end instead, or Latino/Latina, different ways of referring to the group. The Latine seems to be more specific to the LGBTQ community within Latin America, whereas Latino is supposed to be a gender neutral term referring to the broad community. Also, there's Afro-Latino or Afro-Latina if someone has both African heritage and the Latin American heritage, because there were a lot of slaves that were brought to Latin America as well as the United States. Unfortunately, higher portion of those slaves in like Brazil and stuff, they come here, they work, and then they die without being able to create families like they did in the United States and establish establish communities over time. In other Latin America, we look at like Haiti and some of the Caribbean there, where there's maybe predominantly uh, black groups, but again, Afro-Latina for Latino, I've heard commonly used. But again, being more specific, saying someone is Puerto Rican versus Mexican is going to have a different connotation. I've also heard some people get offended if Mexican is used as a broad term to describe people from Latin America. So that could be problematic for some people, just to say, "Oh, you come from Spanish heritage, so you must be Mexican." When a lot of the immigrants, especially right now, the migrants coming to the United States are coming from, Honduras and Guatemala and some places deeper into Central America. So the history of immigration in the United States also has ties to the way the race has been constructed. So we look at white people, again, how race been different with European Americans. Oh, Irish people, they're not really white. Italians, they're not really white. But then they eventually, kind of fit into that group. And then we find the new group of people to to insult as the others, right? Again, it's based on racism, calling, Irish people, saying the Irish are worse than everyone else. Again, that's just racist. It's not anything else. So we need to avoid racism and understand, right? Our history in the United States has a lot of intentional racism in it, and how people were treated, how people were categorized, the laws that were there, and that historical racism still has an impact today. We look at like maps of where people live. There was redlining that Black people can't live in this district, so we see that as a predominantly white neighborhood because of laws like actual laws that were passed a long time ago, policies that were set, and so we can see that long term change, uh, over time, and the impact it continues to have today. So sometimes people say, "Oh, slavery was in the past." Well, the impact of slavery still continues, right? It still continues through those generations. The fact that someone comes from a poorer background because their ancestors were slave can impact who they are today. Have different opportunities and access to bring their family up. Like I come from a working class background, right? My dad worked in a plastic factory for over 40 years. My mom was a lunch lady, uh, or she still is a lunch lady, but worked for over 25 years as a lunch lady. So definitely that working class background. And we look, my great grandparents or my grandparents, both sides of my grandpas were the sole provider, working multiple jobs for their families, and I think they were both janitors. They had other jobs, but they were both janitors for a long time. Before that, farmers, blacksmiths. I mean, again, those jobs changes, but the access to opportunity that they had through those generations, were impacted by the racial background, by their European heritage. May have had access to different jobs and opportunities that help get me to where I am today. Because I feel I'm relatively successful. I like being a community college teacher. I feel I have a comfortable job and a comfortable life overall. But it was because of the hard work of my, you know, and the opportunities that people before me have had, my parents, my grandparents, that helped get me to where I am today. And I know some people that may not have had their families may not have those historical opportunities, may have more difficulty to get to a place such as where I am. And that's not, again, that's historical racism, but there's also current day racism prejudice that exists within the United States against people based on their race, based on their prejudice based on sexual orientation, based on there's people mad at for being rural, living in a rural community. There's biases and stereotypes, working class stereotypes that come from a working class family. So certainly those are prevalent as well. But all the different identities within culture, there definitely can be people in the dominant culture and people in the subordinate culture, and we have a mix of identity, right? Identity is not just one thing. We're not just defined, by our race or by our gender or by our ability, whatever it may be. We have a variety of identities that make up the culture and who we are. And some people may view certain parts of their identity as more prominent. Some people may view other parts of their identity as more, doesn't, they may not notice the impact that it has in their interactions. So in terms of interracial communication, so racial communication are related in various ways. So racism is not always an easy topic for people to discuss. It sometimes can feel politicized, and people can get very defensive because it's like, I'm not racist. I don't want to be called racist. But again, leading into those, like saying, "Oh, I said, Jeff, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was racist. I use the word uppity. I didn't know that was racist." Right. So I apologize. Thank you for calling me out. Thank you for teaching me and helping me learn different ways of being. So oftentimes I'll thank people if they correct me. I don't want to be racist. So thank you for correcting me and letting me know that what I said didn't meet my intentions. So I think that's a very appropriate way to engage in, being willing to challenge each other and being willing to accept those challenges ourselves. So again, being confident communicators and critical thinkers, we must challenge ourselves to be aware of how racism influences communication at the individual and societal level. So just understanding, hey, someone may interpret what I'm saying differently because of their background or because of their experiences. I had a friend at work, and he was an older guy, and he was working with some younger people, and so um, he said he had a younger coworker. He's like, "Hey, boy, come here," and his younger coworker just calling him a boy, and then he's like, "Oh, that coworker is black." Me calling a black person a boy, "Hey, boy," right here may have some racial connotation to it. It's like, oh shoot, I probably shouldn't have said that with that person. When a younger white coworker, if you say, "Hey, boy," they may not still like it just because of ageism, but you know, it's gonna come across differently. So again, just being aware of how different people may may interpret the same message is important part of just generally important part of communication, but especially when it comes to cultural differences. But that doesn't mean avoid communication. We certainly should interact across those differences and learn how to be better if we make mistakes. So, a lot of the, people I've learned about intercultural communication from have shared their mistakes. That's part of the process of making mistakes, but also being willing to learn to do better and challenge ourselves and understand there's different ways to be. So it talks here about an interracial communication that standard English refers to a way of speaking that's based on white middle class ideals, don't match up with the experiences of many. So sometimes, I will say things that aren't grammatically correct, like prepositions. I don't know prepositions. I I just use a preposition and people know what I'm saying. But if I'm typing it and I have like grammar in the background, it will always tell me I'm using the wrong preposition. I still don't know why you use which one. Again, I have a doctorate, I'm also master's degrees. I don't get it. So I don't always use white middle class English, um, you know, the standard English when I'm communicating with people. But to me, I'm communicating. It still conveys meaning, even if I communicate a little bit differently or take more of a working class tone, because that's how I was raised. That's what I grew up with. So it's okay that I'm not using standard English because I'm still communicating meaning. That's how I view things. Other people are like, hey, you're a professor, you need to, meet standard academic English or whatever else. So again, there's bias there, class bias, there's racial bias. It talks here about Black English, being able to, whether it should be used in the classroom. Certainly, it is used in the classroom. I heard one education teacher talking about one of my degrees is in education, and she said there's an experiment where it has you like record yourself talking and then go and grammatically correct it. She had a bunch of pre-service teachers, people going into teaching, do this exercise, and they found out that none of them speak with 100% accurate grammar. Right, we speak differently than we write. So correcting someone's grammar, often Black students will be told to correct, oh, that's not how you say that. It's more often that Black students are being told you're saying that wrong if they're using Black English, or using some sort of slang or just a different pronunciation. They will be corrected. When in reality, no one speaks perfectly English, and so it has a racial connotation to correct the non-standard Black English and not the non-standard white English that may not be grammatically correct. So again, that can have a racial bias to it too. There's also the inclusion of Spanish as a common language, such as JTM or automated services. I remember a time when people were getting very upset that you should not have to, press two for English or something like that. They were very bad. English has to come first. But there's a lot of people who speak Spanish, a lot of people who are bilingual who speak multiple languages, so English, Spanish. Being bilingual is a great strength. I wish I could speak Spanish fluently. I've studied for many years. I'm practically useless. I know the words. I can read some Spanish if I'm trying to understand it. I can pick up a few words if someone's talking to me. But again, it's a struggle. It's a struggle to learn as an adult. So people have that multilingual heritage. It's right to hold on to. But certainly there are people who speak in Spanglish too, so they combine English and Spanish in their conversations as well. And we see that not just Spanish and English, but a lot in multilingual households that may jump between the different languages and just have a broader way of communicating using verbal language and more vocabulary to choose from. Then there's this idea of code switching, which is commonly seen in interracial communication. It talks specifically about people of color may engage in code switching when communicating with other group members because they fear they will be negatively judged. So being able to talk in white English, like I know some Black people who will talk in white English. I had one manager who was a Black woman from Chicago, and she was asking me to do something, and I just looked at her confused, and she's like, "Sorry, I need to speak in white English so you can understand me." So she said it. She said in white English and understood her. She was from the south side of Chicago, so she was talking more in that Black English, which she's more kind of grew up with, and I couldn't understand her, and so she had to code switch for me in order for me to understand. So that's again me needing to get out more and understand how people talk a little bit differently. But sometimes people in dominant groups they can't understand, right? That so again, it's not just about being negatively judged, but it's hard to adapt when you're not familiar with those subordinate group way of communicating. So people need to say things differently. Or even like again, me learning Spanish. If someone speaks Spanish to me but with an American accent, I will understand it much better If they speak slowly with American accent, I can understand it. So I may need a little code switch. And if they speak Spanish to me with a Spanish accent, which is how it's normally going to be pronounced, I struggle a great deal just with the accent difference because the people who taught me Spanish in school were Americans speaking Spanish with American accent. So God, very interesting topic to me. I could go all day about this. I need to continue because you don't want to listen to me lecture all day. So gender again, oftentimes we're meeting a newborn baby. We're asking whether it's a boy or a girl. Oftentimes people are socialized very early on with whatever gender norms they may have. My best friend is having a baby. She's having a baby boy. I went to the store to buy some baby clothes for her, and they had, I found a lot of girl clothes. It's like, oh, should I buy the little boy some pink clothes? I'm like, I don't know. I felt uncomfortable with that. I'm like, why do I feel uncomfortable? It's a baby. The baby don't care what he's wearing, right? It's not going to care that he's wearing something pink. So I got him some clothes. I tried to find some gender neutral colors, but some of them were more blue and definitely boy clothes. And I asked my friend, do you care if if it's girl clothes or boy clothes? Because I'm with girl clothes. And she's like, I don't care. It's a baby. Like, she didn't care if the baby wears pink, whatever. But again, how we interact with the child is going to differ based on the gender. So my sister, she has a young boy as well. So one of the things that she taught him early on was show me your muscles, like make him go like this, right? You're strong, your voice, you gotta show me your muscles. And so he knows how to respond to show me your muscles by doing this. If it was a little girl, would she have taught her how to do show me your muscles? Probably not. Right? We socialize people very early on based on their gender. So gender identity, um, is very prominent within the United States and many cultures across the world. It can be very common, but again, gender is viewed differently. So it talks here about how sex is a biological characteristics. Oftentimes we will associate gender and sex and say, hey, you're a baby, we signed you male at sex at birth, so therefore you're male in gender, and that's how we're going to socialize you. But sometimes, gender is more of a cultural notion. So there's some cultures, especially if we look, some Native American cultures who have, two-spirited as part of their culture. Some kind of Polynesian cultures, which has more of a gender fluid, either maleness and femaleness, and doesn't necessarily view it as a binary. There's cultures, yeah, I've heard in the Middle East, the way they view it is very kind of homophobic and anti-LGBT, but they have some heritage there of people being transgender. That if you only have girls, because sexism in your culture, if you only have girls, well, your oldest girl can act as a boy, right? She can address as a boy and be the boy of her family. So again, having some transgender ideology within the culture and how that is assigned. Right in the United States right now, we think is transgender of someone kind of discovering that about themselves and kind of coming out as transgender and going through a transition process. Where in some other cultures, we see that transgender role is sometimes assigned to someone. Oh, you're the oldest daughter, so therefore you're going to really have daughters, you're going to be the boy, right? You're going to take on a male gender role. So again, it's very gender and sex is definitely a cultural topic, and how it is and how people are socialized, based on the culture. There are a lot of different ways of looking at it, and sometimes we may even not even see what's normal to us is not normal to someone else. So it talks a little bit about here about how it has changed over time of what is, again, it, and then the gender norms. So talks, there's a group in Africa where young boys are responsible for taking care of babies and a girl to be nurturing. So how are these genders socialized, right? We don't always socialize the men to be strong and the women to be nurturing and caring. Certainly there was, if we look at, I think it was the Vikings, they had definitely some women leaders and their kind of warriors. And so when archaeologists look, they look, oh, this person was the leader of the group based on their adornments and what they were wearing. So they just assumed they were men. But now that there's better science, we're like, oh no, they were, they had more of a female, skeletal structure. Certainly in the Middle East, there were some groups, or the Amazonians in Latin America, talking about female warriors, or some in the Middle East where women were the strong, fighters or, leaders of the clan. So whatever it may be, there's a lot of differences in how people are socialized based on the culture. So while we have cultural norms in the United States, that's not everyone's cultural norms. That isn't every culture throughout history. It can be arbitrary in how we socialize people. So I talked a little bit about babies, children. but even into adults of the different roles people can take. It's often um, different based on the culture. So it talks here about patriarchy. So it's a system of social structures and practices that maintain and values priorities and interests of men as a group. So some cultures are more matriarchal, so having the women be in power and that female line. So, for example, Jewish people, oftentimes the bloodline of the Jewish family will go through the woman because the woman knows that it's her baby going out. Whereas the men, again, the woman's having sex with multiple men, you don't know who the father is, but the mother, you kind of hear the baby, it's hers. So that kind of guaranteed the child had some Jewish heritage. So it's sort of matriarchal culture. Um, so again, in my family, my both grandpas on both sides of the family died before the women, and often that is the case women live longer in the United States. And so I have to be, and my mom's family, they had 6 girls and 2 boys, so big Catholic family. But I often viewed it as matriarchal because it was my grandma who was the head of the family. And then when she passed away, I went to one of my aunts, and then, kind of, again, who's keeping the family together often was women. So often I view as kind of my family as more of a matriarchal structure in some ways. But more broadly in the United States, we look at patriarchy as the norm. Um, Certainly, there's subgroups that would have more women be in charge, but men have been treated as generic human beings compared to others, um, and oftentimes we look at men as leaders, as CEOs. We've only had male presidents as we're recording this. We've only had male presidents in the United States. Men make up the majority of members of Congress, of the legislators, of governors, right? So men have historically been in charge. CEOs, even in the nonprofit sector, which is predominantly women, and education, which is predominantly women, we look at the leaders of those organizations are more likely to be men. So certainly we have a lot of patriarchy in who we view as leaders. There's the gender pay gap, which is often because men are socialized to be leaders, and women are socialized into lower paying jobs. So, again, there's been changes in that. There's been, the pay gaps have been closing. There's been a lot more women leaders, women being socialized more to be a leader and seen as being able to take on those leadership roles. So again, that changes again all over the world. These are different norms. So what's normal in the United States may be different in other countries. As of when I'm recording this, just yesterday, Mexico elected their first female president. So again, Mexico never had a female president, and there's a lot of issues with patriarchy in that culture as well. Maybe even more predominantly than in the United States. But again, those things are changing. So there's different ways of dealing with gender and culture. I'm going to keep going because I know this video is going to be long. So I talked a little bit about transgender. So it's an umbrella term for people whose sex identity or expression don't match the sex they were assigned at birth. Some people seek medical intervention like surgery or hormone treatments to match their physiology with gender identity, but that's not necessary for someone to be transgender. There have been other labels in the past, such as transsexual or intersex, among others. That may fit within the broad term. So again, there's a lot, about intersex and that again, that's you can be intersex at birth, right? Not as oftentimes if someone is intersex at birth and they have both male and female kind of biological parts, they're normally the doctors historically have been they'll adjust it to whatever it's closer to. Like, oh, this person has more male parts, so we're just going to fix them up and assign them male at birth, or this person has more female parts, so we're going to fix them up, do some surgery, and assign them female at birth, which is interesting. But again, the intersex people can have, you can have ovaries along with male genitalia on the outside. So again, it's interesting how those. That's a whole take a biology class. I'm a communication instructor. But again, how does that impact communication and gender identity and how people present themselves if they have a variety of different, uh, you know, uh, you know, parts and aspects to their identity? The biology can be weird. I also read a story of a woman who was, she was a woman. She identified as a woman, and assigned female at birth, but she never got her period, and then eventually went to doctor and found out she didn't have a period because her internal organs are male gender organs. So it was interesting how she was kind of grew up as a woman, but just had those other parts as well. So again, yeah, take a biology class if you want to learn more. I'm a communication teacher. And so gender as a cultural identity has implications for real world context, again, like work, how we're socialized, you know, school. It talks about, I already talked about how there's the gender gaps in education and pay. That talks a bit about that there. So sexuality as well. So we talked about race, we talked about gender. So sexuality is something that is often um, socialized to be personal and private, especially again, that's a cultural norm, often comes from religious backgrounds. Sex is sin, and you don't want to be sinful. It's a private thing between married couples. I grew up in a Catholic family, and certainly, my parents never talked about sex. That wasn't something that came up in our household. I hear these things in the media about the birds and the bees, how that's a conversation that parents have with their kids at some age. My parents never would talk to me about sex. Never going to happen. So, but we look in the media too, in pop culture, that the sexuality still gets into our public discourse, even though there's a religious, uh, you know, um, opposition to sexuality in some ways. So sexuality relates to cultural identity beyond just sexual orientation. So it says race is more than one skin color, and gender is more than just the biological and physiological manifestations. Sexuality is not just physical; it's the way we communicate with others about our sexuality. So we can look at sexuality and talking about it, sexually transmitted infections, sexual assault, abuse, harassment, teen pregnancy. All those things can come into our discourse, and what things are appropriate for us to talk about, what things are inappropriate, what things may try and hide from others. Uh, but we also have sexual orientation as part of it. So someone's primary physical and emotional sexual attraction and activity. So often we'll use words like heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual. So the LGBTQ plus communities, how I often hear they have this as GLBTQ. That is, it's a bit outdated. They put the L first because of feminism, and lesbians should come first. I don't know. And then the plus for people who don't necessarily fit within those. So I hear LGBTQ plus, but certainly the alphabet can be different, right? People put in different orders, different letters, but the meaning is the same. So the gay and lesbian rights movement became widely recognizable more in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Very taboo to be gay at that time. Um, even growing up, when I was growing up, it was taboo to be gay, right? It wasn't even talked about in the media much. Even when Barack Obama was elected president, he was opposed to gay marriage. Democrats opposed gay marriage at that time. And it's very interesting in my lifetime where I've seen majority of people very opposed to gay marriage, and it flipped pretty rapidly to saying, okay, I guess we can accept gay people, right? So gay people are accepted, we'll accept gay marriage, and it becomes the law of the land in just a few years. So that was a very interesting time to see those changes occur. Whereas my daughter, I adopted her when she was 15. I'm not that much older than her, but she's a little over a decade younger than me. For her, LGBT is pretty normal. It's widely accepted. Certainly, there's a lot of bias against the LGBT community. She identifies, within that community, and she gets very upset about the stigma and the prejudice that people currently face within that community. And to me, I'm like, you can be out, right? Like this is huge, huge different from when I grew up. So in some ways you should, we've certainly come a long way. And she doesn't even grasp that was like you could be out before. It's, because she sees some harassment or hostility in online spaces, especially against transgender people, which is a very prominent part of political discourse right now in the United States. Attacking transgender people for their identity and related to school sports, and certainly in other ways, a lot of harassment, um, people getting assaulted based on being transgender. So very, very, a lot of very sad things going on there. But again, it's huge in terms of how much growth there has been in terms of visibility and acceptance. Um, but again, that visibility and acceptance has more been towards gays and lesbians, and not so much the transgender or queer aspects of the community where there's still certainly some issues. And it says also here, previous chapter was on media. Bisexuals are rarely visible or included in popular cultural discourse or in the social political movements, right? There's the B in the LGBTQ, but again, bisexuals aren't as prominently seen as part of it. But again, a lot of history there. Certainly, you can learn more about it. I teach about it sometimes too, in more depth. And some of the videos that I share in my classes are related to LGBT communities. So now ability. So again, going to another cultural group. So uh, there's some resistance to classifying ability as a cultural identity because we follow a medical model of disability that places the disability as an individual issue or a medical issue rather than a social and cultural issue of people being included. So often, the American Disabilities Act, a person defines disability as a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, and a person has a history or record of such an impairment or perceived as having an impairment. So again, that's a definition from the American with Disabilities Act. But the medical model of disability is like saying that ADHD is a disability, right? ADHD is a different way of seeing things and operating. And certainly within the United States, as our school systems weren't built around people with ADHD, oftentimes people with ADHD are going to be, my best friend, she was placed in special education because she had ADHD. She has since graduated with honors from the University of Minnesota, going to grad school. Certainly hasn't been a barrier for her, but she's had to learn how to operate with ADHD within the school system. But she's very bright, very intelligent, and I don't think it was appropriate for her to be in special ed. But they put her in special ed because she was bouncing around and just very distracted. And so they're like, oh no, you're disabled, you need to be in the special ed classes. And it's like, just because someone has ADHD and may learn differently, you can't learn by, sitting in a chair staring at the teacher for 8 hours a day. That doesn't mean that they're intellectually, deficited or there's something wrong with them, right? It's just a different way of operating. But here in the United States, we're going to say, oh, you're disabled, right? Even though it's just different. It doesn't necessarily even have to be disabled. I've also heard people with autism and on the autism spectrum, again, just a different way of communicating, a different way of seeing the world. It doesn't need to be seen as a disability, not necessarily. And in other cultural frameworks, we may not say that's disabled, but because of the way our society is structured, often it can be an impairment that limits abilities to get jobs and saying, oh, you communicate weird. I guess I don't want to hire you. Instead of changing those structures to be more accommodating towards people on the autism spectrum. So it says here that ableism is a system of beliefs and practices that produce physical and mental standard that is projected as normal for human beings and labels deviations from it as abnormal, resulting in unequal treatment and access to resources. So sometimes we take our privilege of having an ability for granted, right? We're just, I have full movement. I've heard some people with left-handed say there's definitely a right-hand privilege. We fit that within disability and how things are created more for right-handed people. Uh, so certainly that can be part of it too. And you may have temporary disabilities. So you may be sick for a prolonged period of time. You may break your leg, break a bone. So, again, a lot of people are within the disability group at some point in their life, even maybe when they're older, within the elderly population, you may have some form of disability. So certainly medical advances have allowed people with disabilities to live longer, have more active lives, but access to the those resources and to the medical programs are going to be different for different people. And so again, that's something to consider as well. I'm cutting these short for time. I want to talk so much more about all these topics, but I want to keep moving here as well. So intercultural communication competence is intercultural communications, communication between people with different cultural identities. I kind of think that all communications, some form of intercultural communication, because we all have our own identities, and certainly there are differences. Sometimes we may communicate with someone with more similarities and differences than us, and it may be more similar, but oftentimes there's always going to be a difference. Even in our family, talking to a parent, there's going to be that generational difference related to age. So that even though we may have all the other cultural things the same, like live in the same household, have the same, cultural background, everything else is the same, but the age could be the different thing. So one reason we should study intercultural communication is to foster greater awareness and appreciation of the differences, and just saying, hey, people don't always understand things in the same way that we do, based on our experiences. When I teach intercultural communication, I often have students do an intercultural interview where they interview someone with some sort of difference. You can learn about, the age difference. You can learn about, hey, they really enjoy gaming culture, right? That's a cultural difference. To learn more about a religious difference, whatever it may be, learning about those differences can help us better understand the frameworks in which we use, because often we view ourselves as normal, right? This is normal. This is the way I see things. This is what I'm used to, but it's not necessarily the way that other people see things. So as we become more aware, we may also become more ethical communicators as we challenge our ethnocentrism or a tendency to view our own culture as superior to other cultures. Now, not everybody is ethnocentric, especially if you come from more minoritized cultural background. You may not necessarily view your own culture as superior, but you may still. Or there's some people even in the majority culture who may think there's this, oh, my culture is so much worse than everyone else's, right? All these other cultures are better. We see that a lot with international travel and really exposure to other groups. We may be more critical of our own culture, at least temporarily. So intercultural communication competence is the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in various cultural contexts. So there's a lot of different aspects of it. So part of the aspect could be motivation. If you're more motivated to be intercultural competent, you're going to be more successful at it because you're going to put more effort into it. So if you want to be a thoughtful, caring person, you certainly can put more effort into it. Some people aren't very motivated, just saying, "Hey, other people should accommodate to me." Sometimes people are very proud of their heritage and proud of their community and want other people to adapt to them. Now, if you're in a more minoritized position, you may be forced to code switch or adapt to other people just because they may not understand you, right? If someone's bilingual, and I don't understand their other language, they have to speak to me in English. Otherwise, we can't communicate with each other because maybe I can communicate to them, but they can't, they could avoid communicating back to me. I don't know. But certainly there can be motivation. So if you move to another country, you may be motivated to learn the language of that country. So if I move to Latin America, I have a lot of Spanish language skills. And if I move to Latin America, that may increase my motivation to hurry up and, start learning more fluently or take more time to understand the accent differences. So members of dominant groups are often less motivated intrinsically and extrinsically towards intercultural communication than members of non-dominant groups because they don't see the incentives for doing so. I tend to be, a lot of my identities are in dominant groups. I try to be very thoughtful in learning about other perspectives, but sometimes it's just hard for me to adapt because I don't have many opportunities to do so, or many opportunities where I'm forced to do so. So again, that can be part of it as well. So it talks again about code switching. So intrinsic motivation captures an idyllic view of intercultural communication as rewarding in its own right. And it could create extrinsic motivation by putting yourself in situations where you're going to have to force to interact differently. But again, there's also that risk that it's going to be seen as incompetent. I've talked about this before. Sometimes people avoid intercultural communication situations because they don't want to say the wrong things. I don't want to be seen as racist, so I'm just going to avoid talking to people with that background, right? Well, counterintuitive, but it does happen. I don't want to put my foot in the mouth, so I'm going to limit my contact and what I say here because I don't want to say the wrong thing. And that's not necessarily the most helpful. So knowledge can help with intercultural communication competence as well. In the last chapter, I talked a little bit about media, and exposing yourself to diverse media can help you learn about other cultures. Intercultural travel, if you that's a privilege to have. I was privileged to travel in England and also Nicaragua when I was a student to study abroad programs, and they helped me learn a lot more about my own culture. I talked a little bit about going to the Northern Cheyenne Nation, so within the United States too. Certainly, there's opportunities for exposure to other cultures and help us learn a little bit more about ourselves while learning about other people as well. So the best way to learn other knowledge about other cultures is direct, thoughtful encounters. But again, there can be barriers. So again, watching television shows, reading, you know, whatever it may be, whatever exposure you can get can be very helpful. So it says an example here: a heterosexual person may have a gay or lesbian friend, but they might spend most of their other time with other heterosexuals. So again, may not have a lot of contact. You may have minimal contact with someone in another group that you want to be thoughtful and caring about. And sometimes we don't even know someone else's identity, right? If someone's not out to us as gay, we may not know that you're interacting with a gay person. If someone's not out about a disability, that they have mental health issues or a learning disability, you may not even know it. So certainly you've probably interacted with people of other cultural groups without knowing it. Religion, you can have someone from another religion. Sometimes religion's visible. Someone's wearing a cross or wearing a hijab or has some visual representations of their religion. But other people, they don't go with those adornments. And you may not know you're talking across those, you're engaged in intercultural communication. You may not even realize it. So it talks a little bit about mindfulness here. So in this context of intercultural communication, it's a state of self and other monitoring that informs later reflection on communication interactions. So we want to be mindful and ask, how's this communication going? What are my reactions? What are their reactions? Maybe we don't even, if we're mindful, we could see that we're putting our foot in our mouth, even if we don't know what we said that was wrong, and check in with them about it. Another term here is cognitive flexibility. So it refers to the ability to continually supplement and revise existing knowledge to create new categories rather than forcing new knowledge into old categories. So it just helps us, seeing the world in a different way, saying, hey, maybe my framework for viewing this situation is wrong. How can I view things differently? How can I challenge myself to understand this other culture, this other group a little bit better, instead of using the old categories and old stereotypes, which I've been relying on? There's also a tolerance for uncertainty. So about the attitudes and level of comfort in uncertain situations. So some people prefer better with uncertainty. So me, I one of the reasons I decided to become a communication instructor is because I have some social anxiety, and I did not view myself as a good communicator. So I studied communication classes because it was very practical and helpful to help me learn how to be a better communicator. But I don't like new situations still. Even as a communication instructor, I don't have a lot of tolerance for uncertainty. So if I'm in a brand new situation, like I don't know how to interact here, and so I that's when my social anxiety comes back. So often I like being in situations which I'm familiar and comfortable with. So I don't have a lot of tolerance for uncertainty, and that may be one of the reasons which I struggle with learning Spanish because it's like, okay, I don't feel comfortable and confident in my Spanish speaking abilities, so I avoid those situations because I don't have a lot of tolerance for uncertainty and how that's going to go. So certainly, if you're more willing to have some uncertainty, push yourself, right? It's always good to push your boundaries, but to your comfort zone. I've pushed my boundaries certainly from when I was like in high school, and very much I'm still an introvert, but I was very quiet and didn't like talking to people. Now I'm much more willing to engage with other people and communicate, but there are some situations which may make me more anxious than others. But again, it's being able to tolerate that anxiety and work through it. So cultivating intercultural communication competence. So how can it be built and achieved? We need to have a good attitude about it, and again, having that motivation that's important. We want to discover knowledge that informs us. So it can be through communication interactions and pushing ourselves into uncomfortable situations. It can be learning through the media, through books, through readings, whatever it may be. And then taking opportunity to develop skills that enable us. So learning how to adapt yourself and feel comfortable with different communication styles and frameworks. And again, me going to Northern China Nation and being uncomfortable with having to wait for somebody else. Right, that was a new experience for me. I wasn't very happy with it at first until I started understanding what was going on there, and then I was much more accepting of the situation. And just when I was able to see that it was a cultural difference, and that wasn't a sign of disrespect. So being able to push yourself can be very important. So developing intercultural communication competence is a complex process. So you start to accumulate knowledge, you put it into your existing framework, but then we have to start applying that knowledge. So again, transformative learning takes place when we're encountering those new situations and applying it. I learned about monochronic time and polychronic time in the textbook in my intercultural communication class. But whenever I was faced with a situation where I had to wait at the Boys and Girls Club, for a couple of hours, I was very frustrated. And I did not apply that knowledge right away. I had to be helped to apply the knowledge. I had the knowledge, right? I knew about it, I learned about it. But it wasn't until I was able to see that, oh, this is the knowledge that needs to be applied here, and have that experience. That's when I was able to change and grow as a person. So sometimes even learning something from this textbook, I learned a little bit about the LGBTQ community in the textbook. Now I feel more comfortable with it. Well, yeah, when you start applying the knowledge, when you get out there, um, you may start seeing things differently and being able to get those experiences. So it says you can study abroad, you can volunteer for Special Olympics, you can go to a shelter for the LGBTQ community, the youth. They have very high homeless rates in the LGBTQ community. A lot of people, because they're get kicked out of homes and certainly experience some trauma and other things. I mean, it's a lot of things going on there. Again, even though there may be seen as broad acceptance and pride and everything else, there's still certainly issues, even if there's some degree of acceptance. So reflection should also include critical incidents or aha moments for us to start understanding, how we're growing as communicators, seeing a variety of communities. So again, I've been talking a lot about intercultural communication. I love this topic. I love teaching about it. I like incorporating culture in if you've been watching my other textbook lectures, I've incorporated intercultural communication in those lectures as well. But certainly this is a very important topic that can be, um, fit into all the different types of communication that, public speaking can look at for intercultural communication, interpersonal communication, listening, nonverbal communication. All these things have cultural elements, right? Everything is a part of our culture and a part of our identity. We bring our identity to every communication interaction that we have, and it's helpful to be thoughtful and accepting of other people as well. So hopefully, if you take nothing else away, just say, hey, people can communicate and understand things differently than I do based on their culture. And I may not know their culture, and that's okay. So again, having some mindedness, learning about other cultures, exposing yourself to new situations with an open mind can be very helpful. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this lecture. I had a lot of things that I love talking about, and I would have loved to keep talking about it. But I was trying to be concise for time because that's my European American heritage. That monochronic time, I want to keep it concise and uh, make sure to respect other people's time, because that's respect based on my cultural norms, whereas other cultural norms may be more respectful to continue talking and elaborating on some of these topics in more depth. So again, different ways of viewing the same situation. But I digress, and I'm going to let you go. Always feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I'm glad to chat more about this topic anytime.